Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is May 25th, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to our lecture. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their third year of support. We especially thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. Without your membership, we would not be able to host the lecture series. We'd love to have you join us if you're not a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support the world's first and oldest Korean studies organization. For 121 years, we have strived to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. Members receive our annual journal Transactions. Members are also recognized reciprocally by most of Asia's RAS affiliated societies, as well as the London-based original RAS. See our website at raskb.com for details. I will post a link in the chat box momentarily. If you are not a member, we request a one-time admission fee. Please refer to the donation page on your screen for PayPal and bank transfer information. This information will also be posted in the chat box. We are joined tonight by Dr. Thomas Duvernay. Tom has a doctorate in Korean studies and is a professor at Yungnam University in Gyeongsang, Korea, where he teaches Korean history and English. His main historical focus is on the late Joseon dynasty of Korea with an emphasis on the 1871 military action between the United States and Korea, which he has been researching since the mid-1990s. His new book, Sinmiyangyo, the 1871 conflict between the United States and Korea, is available in print or ebook on Amazon. He campaigned for years for the return of the Korean general's banner that was captured by the U.S. naval forces in the action and was housed at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in the United States. The banner was returned in 2007. Besides writing about the 1871 action in many journal articles, Tom is also the author of a book on Korean traditional archery, which he has practiced since 1993. He has lived in Korea with his family since 1989, after first living in the country in 1984. His wife, Moon-ok Lee, is a high school English teacher here in Korea, and his son Nick is a PhD professor at the Hankook University of Foreign Studies. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Please welcome Professor Duvernay.
Thank you very much. Is my volume okay?
Your volume's good.
Great, glad to hear it. Thank you very much for inviting me to lecture on this. I will try to get through and hopefully my voice holds out. As I said, the dust and other things have been doing a number on it. But anyway, I made this lecture. Matter of fact, I've been kind of modifying it right up until almost the last minute, going through and just trying to make sure that everything is as self-explanatory as possible in many ways, because anyone who knows me, when I start talking, I can go off on a tangent, and what was meant to be a 1 hour online thing can easily go to 2 or 3 hours. So
we won't let that happen tonight, Tom.
Well, yeah, and that's one reason why I tried to streamline my PowerPoint presentation, so it'll kind of keep me coloring between the lines as much as possible. So anyway, let me start sharing my screen with you here. Let me find it. And oops. All right, well, hopefully everyone can see this okay.
Looks good.
All right, great. But anyway, yeah, we're talking about the Sinmiyangyo. And the first thing I will probably should just mention is the name itself. Although many here may understand the system of naming years and such in the old Korean system, the sexagenary system of naming things, naming the years, I'm sorry. Some people might not, so just a little bit of a lesson on that. The Shinmi part of it is dealing with the year, and so it was the Shinmi years, the Sinmiyangyo, which is the year 1871. The Yangyo referred to, well, it's always been kind of loosely translated to Western disturbance. So the Western disturbance of 1871 is kind of what it was kind of looked at. And then I just called it the 1871 conflict between the United States and Korea. And also this is the Sesquicentennial. As a matter of fact, even tonight, you know, the 25th of May, 2021, exactly 150 years ago right now, the US was in Korean waters. So we are really truly exactly 150 years on from when this happened. And so let's just get right into it here. Now, one thing is that the gunboat diplomacy, you know, we could say that through gunboat diplomacy that the China was opened up to the West in 1842, Japan in 1858. But the thing was is that Korea was still an enigma, as I have written here. The one question that is very often asked of me is, why did the United States come to Korea in 1871? And that's really probably the main thing, is just that, well, there were rumors about Korea. And a lot of those rumors were fueled by past attempts, you know, from, you know, 1866, 1867, and 1868, when Westerners came into Korea, and the ones who did return to the West and such, they had their stories, and that it was imagined that, you know, there were all kinds of treasures in Korea and what have you. But still, Korea was still an enigma. China was known, Japan was known, but Korea was still that nut that wasn't yet cracked. And so the United States thought they would give themselves a try coming here to Korea. And well, actually, probably for a couple of years prior to 1871, 2-3 years prior, there were the hawks in Washington, D.C., who really wanted to get into Korea. And they just wanted to do this really almost at all costs. And it just seemed like 1871 they felt was their chance to do so. And so that was when this voyage to Korea was planned. The plans actually were started, I think, in 1870 was when they really started getting down to some serious plans to go to Korea. But 1871 was when they were finally able to do it. And the Americans had really two official goals. The first goal was to sign a treaty with Korea for the treatment of shipwrecked sailors on Korean shores, for the, that they would be treated well. And then, if possible, to look into a trade treaty. So those were the two official stated goals. Whether there were further goals than that is somewhat debatable. Some people say there were, other people say, no, that's really about what it was at that time. But anyway, as it happened on May 16th of 1871, 5 U.S. ships of the U.S. Asiatic Squadron set sail from Nagasaki, Japan to Korea. And the 5 ships were the USS Alaska, which was a steam gunboat, the USS Benicia, which was also a steam gunboat, and the USS Colorado, the flagship, was a steam frigate. And then also the USS Monocacy, double-ended gunboat, and the USS Palos, which was an iron screw tug that was converted to a gunboat. Now, it's notable because the first 3, these were large wooden warships, and they were not able to go into shallow waters. But the last 2, the Monocacy and Palos, they were built specifically for river warfare. And so these were really the 2 ships that actually took part in the fighting itself when it happened. Some people inaccurately try to tie the 1871 action directly to the 1866 incursion by the privately owned ship General Sherman. And I put this photo here mainly for illustrative purposes, because as I note, some people argue that this was not the same ship, because supposedly the General Sherman was originally a ship that was called the Princess Royal, that was originally a Confederate ship that was captured by the Union during the American Civil War, and then was sold afterwards and became the Princess Royal. The Princess Royal, I'm sorry about that. Princess Royal then became the General Sherman. But there are a lot of conflicting information on this. And so that's why I'm just mainly using this one for illustrative purposes. But anyway, the General Sherman is very often, people will use this as the reason why the United States came to Korea in 1871, but that was not a direct reason. Was it a reason at all? Yeah, sure. At least it was a stated reason. Mostly it was afterward. After the United States left Korea in 1871, it was used kind of more as an excuse than anything else. But it was well known by the United States government that the General Sherman was little more than a pirate ship. It was a private ship that was American owned. It was being leased by a British company. Most of its little more than 24 crew were mostly Southeast Asians. And by the end of the 1860s, the United States seemed to be pretty satisfied with, that the General Sherman was destroyed, that none of the crew survived, etc. Now, one thing is that people sometimes, and I think one of the reasons where the inaccuracy comes from is people hear the term punitive expedition, but it wasn't punitive in regards to the General Sherman. It was punitive in regards to what happened in 1871, which we'll talk about soon. In any case, as there were several foreign intrusions into Korean waters in the few years before 1871, the Korean regent, the Daewon-gun Lee Ha-eun, wanted no interaction with other countries. He already had his experience with the French, with the General Sherman, with the German Oppert, and he just really had no interest in other interactions with Western countries. Back to our story, the squadron arrived off Korea's west coast on May 19th, and by May 23rd, due to fog, they temporarily anchored around Ipado in Asan Bay, so right way down in here. And they named it Rose Roads after the French Admiral Rose from 1866, the Sinmiyangyo, which that was called. They were about 40 kilometers south of their destination of Wase Island, Jagyakdo, which is that little dot right there in between Yeongjongdo, which the international airport is on now, and Incheon over here. But on May 30th, the squadron finally reached its destination. And this is a photo that was taken by Felice Beato, who the 1871 photos that I will show here were all taken by Beato. He was along with the squadron to take such photos. Now this one was taken on the south side of the island, and this modern one, which I took probably about 20 years ago, so I just call it modern day. This was taken on the north side. And just to show just a map of where it is, it's that little dot right there where my cursor is. This is a satellite view. This is only about 500 meters from end to end, so it's not a really large island. And then again, just another satellite view just to show it between Yeongjongdo and Incheon. And when the Americans first came into Korean waters, the villagers, they were curious. They interacted with the Americans. This particular photo, which is one of Beato's and was also quite famous, is of this gentleman here with an armful of beer bottles. As a matter of fact, they're Bass Ale, which you can buy here in Korea if you go to E-Mart sometimes. But he had that. He had his dambite, his pipe, and also he had an issue of the magazine Every Saturday, this particular one. It's just kind of representative that, at first the Korean civilians were curious, but later on the government ordered Koreans to steer clear of the Americans. So on May 30th, messengers arrived at the Colorado to announce that government officials would visit the following day. And I put this here really, again, for illustrative purposes, because these almost certainly were not the officials, even though they were noted as such in Beato's photos. But the reason why I really doubt it is because, and this is one excerpt out of my book, is that Lieutenant Hugh McKee, Navy Lieutenant Hugh McKee, who was one of 3 Americans who was killed in the fighting in 1871, he was on duty that day, and he put into the Colorado's deck log the description of the messengers who came. And he wrote that 2 Koreans dressed in dark blue, showing them as 3rd ranked officials, and 1 dressed in light blue, showing him as a 5th ranked official. And then there were about 20 low ranked attendants with them. In any case, when the officials arrived, it was determined they were of low rank. So Mr. Frederick Lowe, Minister Plenipotentiary to China, refused to meet them. Instead, he had his secretary, Edward B. Drew, who was fluent in Chinese, meet with them, along with 2 Chinese scribes. Mr. Drew informed the envoys of the squadron's intentions, to which he was greeted with silence. He took it as tacit approval, but it was actually dissent. And this is actually a very, to me, has always been kind of an important point. To the American side, the Koreans not saying anything was like, okay, we have no problem, no objection. But to the Korean side, it meant completely the opposite. We did not give you permission to explore our waters, so we don't allow you to do so. And later on, things were written about this by the Koreans, and they said, well, you know, even fishermen who go in the waters that the Americans went into have to have written permission to go up and down the waters. They have to show this written permission. So, you know, a foreign warship doing that, you know, that was, you know, just not acceptable at all. But the Americans took it as, okay, no problem. So the next day, June 1st, the 2 gunboats I talked about, the Monocacy and Palos, along with steam launches and cutters, they headed up the straits known as the Salt River, the Yamha. So they left Jagyapdo, and then they started heading through here. And this is the Yamha, the Salt River, or the Ganghwa Straits. And for most of the way up the straits, no signs of hostility. Now, I just want to point this out, is that over here, this was the chart that the Americans were using in 1871. They borrowed it from the French, who were there in 1866, and then they modified it. And then they were starting to do their own soundings and everything, and they were marking these on their chart. And the thing I've always found very fascinating is you have the chart here. This is a satellite view. And it's just uncanny how accurate the 1871 chart was to the satellite view. And it was really great because it really helped a lot when doing actual field research. Anyway, until the small force started rounding a bend where the current was very swift, that's right here and right here. And you can see they marked swift current here, and you can see it in this photo here. Then what happened was the Korean forces on both sides of the straits opened fire on the Americans. So you had the Ganghwa side started firing whatever they had. They had small cannons, they had their matchlock muskets, they had gun tubes, they had everything, firing from both the Ganghwa side and also on the mainland side. And then the Americans were forced to turn around north of where they were fired upon in order for them to return fire. So they did a turnaround here, and you can see from the satellite view where that was. And then the Monocacy hit a submerged rock, and which is right here, this little island called Buresum. And so it would have been right about there. And it put a hole in its hull. 2 sailors had sustained injuries, and the ships had limited ammunition. So they decided they're going to return to their anchorage and to just get further orders. Minister Lowe and Rear Admiral John Rogers sent a message to the Korean palace that they would give them 10 days to offer an explanation and apology for the attack on their forces. And they had two reasons for that. One was, well, okay, they wanted to have an explanation as to why they were fired upon, but also after 10 days, the tides would be much better, much more favorable to mount an invasion. And on the morning of June 10th, when there was no real apology or explanation given by the Koreans, the Monocacy and Palos, with a force of 759 men, headed back up the straits. And when I say no real apology, what I mean is there was according to the records, the American records, the Koreans floated a raft down the water to them. On the raft were some cows, chickens, and many, many eggs, and a note that said basically to the effect of, you'll be hungry on your way home. That's pretty much what the intention was. And of course, the Americans didn't see that as an apology, and definitely not an explanation. Now, the landing party was composed of 546 sailors and 105 Marines. The sailors were armed with 50 caliber breech loading Remington rolling block carbines, similar to this one here. These are some of the originals that I found during some of my field research, just so you can see them. These were for the carbine, and actually this one was a complete cartridge there, and just the casing here for the Remington rolling block pistol, both 50 caliber. And it was the sailors that had these. The Marines were armed with M1861 58 caliber Springfield and 69 caliber Whitneyville Plymouth muzzle loading rifles. So what they had were these, which you could shoot maybe 1 to 3 times a minute, depending upon the situation. And that was because they had to be loaded down the muzzle ends. And it took time to do that. And these are a couple of the original bullets that I found. This one is for the 69 caliber Plymouth, and this one here is for the 58 caliber Springfield. This is the Plymouth, this is the Springfield. US sidearms. I have here showing a 38 caliber Navy conversion, because this was originally a 36 caliber, what they call cap and ball, which was essentially a muzzle loader. And then, but it was able to change out this cylinder to make it into a cartridge arm. And this was an officer's sidearm, a Navy officer. And although some of the officers still had the 36 caliber cap and ball, many had changed out the cylinders so that they could use metal cartridges. And then this is the Remington rolling block pistol, the 50 caliber pistol, rimfire. And this was carried by auxiliary troops, sappers, miners, and the hospital corps. I just put the title Korean matchlock musket, but actually probably only these top 2 ones were actually Korean matchlocks. These are actually Japanese. And there's quite a history in Korea with this style of matchlock, going back to the Imjin War, 1592 to 1598, which is when Japan used these against Korea, and then Korea adopted it as their own military arm for the next 300 years. Korean cannon. Mainly, Korea had the small bore, which were called bolanggipo. And this particular one on the right is from a photo I took. This is at the Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. And it's one of 2 items I'm working to get back to Korea. So it's one of my ongoing projects. And then also this was the Hongipo, which was a bit larger iron cannon, very old style. Anyway, the Americans, as they were coming up the Yamha, the Salt River, while passing Louise Island, which is Hwangsando, this island here, which is now connected to Ganghwa-do. A fortress was noted and a few shells were shot into it, but it was deserted. And there is a little bit of a story here, but I'm showing a 24-pounder. This is a Dahlgren, a 24-pounder Dahlgren boat howitzer, rarely used on land, mostly just used on shipboard. And it was rifled, and it fired 4-inch Schenkels. And this is one that I'll show you a little bit further on down, but this was actually found on Hwangsando. Anyway, the flotilla continued on to the Choji fortresses, Choji-donde and Choji-jin, which we can see here both in the chart and also with satellite image. And right about where the Choji Bridge is now, this is right about where the ships stopped, the Monocacy and Palos, to offload all of their troops. So right about where this is. And then there were 7 Dahlgren boat howitzers, and these were called 12-pounder boat howitzers. And they had this route right here. And then I'm showing it both on the chart, because that's where it was shown, and where it would have been here, because where it shows mud flats here, this is all reclaimed farmland now. So, but this all used to be mud flats. This was tidal. And one thing I wanted to note is, you had 7 cannon, but each one had about a 10 to 11 member gun crew. So you have at least about 70 men who are just having to tend to the cannon. And then the infantry force went ashore just behind the fortresses. So on their chart, and also here, satellite view about where they would have landed. And then once ashore, it was late in the day. So the sailors made camp west of the fortresses. And this is where they show it. And today, that same spot, you can see a whole grouping of houses. And here you can see the reclaimed farmland. This is a photo I took by drone. Very helpful to be able to see how everything is and was. And then the Marines set up an encampment picket line north of the main US camp. So you see it here on the chart. And it's this hill right here, which interestingly today has foxholes in it for Korean Marines. Sailors and Marines set about destroying the Choji fortresses, but waited until the next morning to finish the job. The night was fairly quiet, with only one attempt at attack by Korean forces. Here's a photo of the Choji-donde. They call it Choji-jin, but Choji-jin actually doesn't even exist anymore. But this was the one taken by Beato in 1871. And this is the photo I took in 2000. And you can see quite a bit the same. And then drone shot I took from the other side just this last year. Early the next morning, June 11th, the Americans finished knocking down walls, burning stores, and tossing cannons into the straits. After that, they started towards the next fort. So these were shots that were taken inside the Choji fortresses by Beato of the troops. And if when you look at these photos in detail, all kinds of things you can see about uniforms and equipment that the sailors had, the Bulangipo cannon sitting there. You had a killed in action Korean defender here, and he's wearing the Myeongap, the Myeongjae Begap, which is the cotton body armor, and also a Myeontugu, which was the helmet. All kinds of things. When you look here, just and another cannon there, just lots of detail. In any case, once the landing party arrived at the hill below Dokjin-donde, which is the next fortress, 1/3 of the Marines went up the hill to dismantle it. At the same time, a company of sailors dismantled Duck Jin Jin. And so on the left, you can see the photo that Beato took. And by the way, this is really not that, he took the photo not all that far from the fortress itself. It looks farther than what it really is. I tried to take a similar photo, again, using a drone, and my drone ended up in the trees that are now quite high there. So I substituted same angle photo, but a lot closer. When the Dukjin forts were destroyed, the Americans continued their line of march, this time over hills. And here you can see, this is the Dukjin Donde here, and this is Dukjin Jin. And the Marines originally went up the back of this mountain, which you can't do anymore because there's some Buddhist association built a lot of buildings up here now. But anyway, now they're going to be starting their line of march that's going over hills. And so showing it on the chart, and here you can see here where it's on the satellite view. And when the Americans arrived in Bongol village, which is in Deokseongni, they set up an artillery battery on top of a hill to counter the Korean troops and hills running parallel to theirs. And I called this one the first artillery position. And you'll notice here, again, showing a crop out of the chart and this little triangle I put here to show that this delta is still there. I mean, so the chart matches up so well with satellite views that it really helped a lot when doing field research and finding out things. Now you'll notice here, covered with trees, this first artillery position, but here, this is one that I took at the end of this last year, and the trees have been all cut down and they're building houses up there and everything now, which is too bad. A lot of the historical sites are now being lost, which is one reason why I was in such a hurry over the years to do field research before development ate it all up. And this was the workhorse cannon that the Americans used. It was the Dahlgren 12-pounder smoothbore boat howitzer, along with the shell and shot that it used. This is one that's at the United States Naval Academy. And then this is one that was on board another ship, showing how they were how sailors were loading it. And very quickly, let me just kind of go through on this one. This shows the fuse of a 12-pounder smoothbore explosive shell. And this one actually has a little story to it, because this one, I took this photo back in 1999. I took the photo in what was then called the Ganghwa Historical Center. It's now the Ganghwa War Museum. And as I was looking at the display case back then in 1999, I looked at the tag that said, it said Joseon Cannonball. And I said, there are two things wrong with that. Number one, that's an American explosive shell. And number two, it's still live. I called my friend, Colonel Kim Gi-hoon at the, he's retired now, but he was a professor at the Korea Military Academy. And I told him what I found there. He called the director of the historical center, and I understand that director didn't sleep all night. The next day, they had Korean EOD guys come in, and they took anything out that was spherical, even solid shot they took out. And sadly, we never heard anything again from the shell, about the shell. So I'm guessing that they probably detonated it somewhere, and which is too bad, because it could have been deactivated, would have made a really nice museum piece. But anyway, the explosive shell, its purpose was to explode in front and above enemy forces to spread its fragments down, its iron fragments down on the enemy. And then this just shows it strapped to a wood sabot. and this is its powder charge down here. And then just showing what one looks like cutaway. And then one of the workhorses for the Americans as they were moving along very quickly was canister shot. And basically what it is a can filled with iron balls, which turns this cannon into a giant shotgun. And these are some of the iron canister shot that were found during the field surveys, and just kind of showing from a cannon what happens. When it leaves the muzzle, it breaks open and it spreads out conically, and it takes out anyone in its way. And then there was the 9-inch Dahlgren shell gun. And this is one that would have been on the ships. This particular one is in my hometown of Petoskey, Michigan. This one was off the USS Hartford, famous in the US Civil War, in the Battle of Mobile Bay during the American Civil War. And then this is showing a gun crew manning a 9-inch Dahlgren shell gun. And then, as you can guess, this is approximately 9. It's a little bit, the diameter is a little bit less than 9 inches for windage, as they call it, inside the muzzle of the gun. And then these were some shell fragments from a 9-inch that were found nearby the battle areas on Gangma Island. And then the Manwan note just to kind of show you size. Anyway, the first artillery battery shot several rounds toward the Korean troops seen massing on the hills across from them. A second artillery battery was set up on a high hill between the first artillery hill and the Sondomok fort to cover advancing troops and to also fire into the fort. And so I show that here, both again on the chart and satellite view. So this is the first artillery hill, and this is where the second artillery was positioned. Now there are tombs up there. And then this is I used a drone to be able to get over some of the trees that are right here. And you can see the Sondomok fortress here, that was their objective. The main American force went towards their objective. Sailors went center and left of the hills leading to the fort, and Marines went right. So again, on the chart and satellite view, what happened, with the objective being right there. At 10 a.m. on June 11th, the Monocacy began firing 15-second shell from its after 9-inch gun from a distance of 1,200 yards south-southwest of the Sondomok fort, along with the battery on the hill overlooking the fort, and continued its fire until 11 a.m. when a signal was given to cease fire. So you have from the second artillery hill firing into it, and also from the Monocacy firing into it. And then just again, looking at that from a satellite view. And sometimes you have to worry about the 15-second shell, because it only probably took about 3 to 4 seconds for the shell from the Monocacy to reach the fortress here, only 3 or 4 seconds. And one reason probably why they were using 15-second shell is because they wanted the shell to, when they're going against a structure, embed itself in the ground and then blow up and hopefully take down a lot of the structure that they were shooting at. So there's that. So signal given to cease fire. Sailors took up resting positions just behind the hills facing the fortress, and the Marines were much closer, only about 50 meters or so south of the fortress. They shot at any Korean defender who showed himself. Around 11 a.m. when the signal was given for artillery to cease fire, the sailors and Marines rose up and charged the fort. Now here are the different companies on these hills, and they stretched from the west side all the way over to here. The Marines were here, very separate. Company D, this was led by Lieutenant Hugh McKee, as I said, who was one of them, one of the 3 U.S. killed in action. Now, actually, before the charge was given, many of these men went down into this ravine here, including Lieutenant McKee. So when the order was given to charge, not only would you have sailors standing up here and charging down the hill and then up here, Marines standing up here and going here, but you also had pre-positioned sailors down here that are now just heading up the hill. The Marines near the fort stood up, and one of them, Private Dennis Hanrahan, was struck and killed by a Korean round ball. And I'll just mention Dennis Hanrahan, he was born in Kilkenny, Ireland, and he would have the distinction of being the first U.S. serviceman killed in battle in Korea. The sailors raced up the side of the hill, and the Koreans, not having enough time to reload, threw rocks and dirt at the attackers. Navy Lieutenant Hugh McKee was the first over what remained of the walls. Remember, the walls were brought down by all that artillery fire. With a sword, and it was noted by more than one person that he had a sword in one hand and a revolver in the other as he went over what was left of the walls. He was shot in the groin and speared in the side. Another sailor, Seth Allen, was shot in the chest as he climbed up the rampart, and he died. And the fighting was actually quite short. It was brutal and intense, but only lasted about 15 or 20 minutes. So not all that long. In the end, around 240 Korean dead were counted in and around the fort. The U.S. lost 3. The Korean commander, General Jae-un, was killed by a U.S. Marine, and his flag, the Sujagi, was captured by 2 other Marines. And then looking inside, these are a couple of the famous photos of the Korean dead inside the Sondomok fortress. And this photo is looking east-southeast. And then this one is looking west-northwest. And you can kind of position yourself just looking at this hut and the rafters that were coming out of here. You can see the same rafter over here. So you can see how Beato was placing himself to take these photos. Here's the exterior of the west-northwest wall. And this is the modern day entrance. So this is nowadays. And this is how it was after it was brought down by all the artillery fire. And then I just kind of outlined what was left of one of the doors. And I put this is a door that's at Hwasong. And I put it here just to show the Taeguk symbol and how it would have looked when this door was whole. Then take a look at the interior. All right, so you have your west-northwest wall interior. And so this is where they called this the general's headquarters. And this is that photo nowadays. And then I overlaid this photo onto this one just to give you an idea how that kind of fits in there. And then the east-southeast wall, you have the photo of the Korean dead here. Mainland is over here. And this is nowadays in the reconstructed fort. And then with this photo overlaid on this one. Remaining Korean forces tried to escape, but most were stopped by artillery fire. These are a couple of ways that the Koreans were trying to escape. Some of them were trying to go to the Gwangsungbo main fortress, which is down this way. And then others were trying to escape down to the water. And so many of them were taking the footpath, which is still there, to find their way down to the water to escape. There were about, at the time, they wrote about 240 Korean dead in and around the fort. In the end, it was estimated probably 300 to 350 Korean dead. And there were only about 20 Korean defenders who were taken prisoner. The Americans stayed overnight on June 11th in the area of the fort. And this is kind of how they were set up here, which companies were where. This, as I said, this used to be Lieutenant McKee's company, but he was killed. And so, so Chip took over for him. You had different pieces of artillery in different places. You had the pioneers, and even some troops stayed overnight inside the fortress itself. The next day, June 12th, the landing party boarded boats and headed back to the Monocacy, and then down to their anchorage and rejoined their ships. So again, it's really nice that you can easily match up what was put onto their charts with what it looks like today. So everyone got back on the Monocacy because the Palos was out of action right now. On the first day of fighting on June 10th, the Palos, it hit a rock and it was put out of action. So the Monocacy was doing all of the coverage of the troops as they made their way along the hills. So it was giving them cover with its guns, such as the 9-inch Dahlgrens, along with they also had 100-pounder Parrott rifles, which were they were actually rifled artillery, and some other guns that they were able to give the troops cover as they moved along their line of march. The U.S. Asiatic Squadron stayed in Korean waters until July 3rd. After that, they set sail for Jefu, which is now Yantai, China, and they arrived there on July 4th, which was American Independence Day. And we'd say that the U.S. won the battles militarily, but as Korea never gave in to demands, it arguably won diplomatically. Short story here, and this one is one of canister shot and what we call a bite bullet. When we had our last RASKB tour, I showed several people where this was, and I gave the story. But this is the photo that I showed just a few slides previously. And the reason why I have this here is because for two reasons. You have A and B, and they both point to something. A is where the area where this canister shot, a clump of canister shot were found. And this 50 caliber bullet was also found with teeth marks in it. And B would have shown approximately where that American artillery piece would have been when it shot. And the reason is because, as we said, with canister shot, it turns a cannon into a giant shotgun. And the canister shot, these iron balls, they would spread out very quickly after they left the muzzle of the barrel. So because they were so close together still, when they were found, it really was an indication that the cannon, the howitzer, the boat howitzer, was not far away when it shot that. And not far from that, I came across this 50 caliber bullet with teeth marks. And it was like a light went off in my head, because it kind of made sense. The Americans probably saw all these Koreans who were trying to escape along that footpath, the one right here. And they probably very quickly turned their boat howitzer and they shot it very quickly without aiming or anything. Most of the shot went into the side of the hill just below this foot trail, but probably one of them, one iron ball, hit a Korean, probably in the leg. Could have been an arm, but most likely a leg, because a leg definitely would have stopped him from running. If he had been hit in the torso or in the head, he would have been dead. So my guess is one of these caught him in a leg. The Americans, wanting to take as many prisoners as possible, probably did a field amputation of what was left of his leg. And this is an unfired 50 caliber bullet with teeth marks in it. So to me, the story kind of wrote itself. Now, is it absolutely true? Who knows? But it really kind of makes sense when you look at where all of this was found and in what situation it was found. We talked about the flag, the Sujagi, the Jangungi, it's also known as. This is after it was captured in 1871. And you have Private Hugh Purvis here, Corporal Charles Brown here. And this sailor here, his name was Cyrus Hayden. He was credited with putting the American flag up in the fortress. He received a Medal of Honor for that. And these two received a Medal of Honor for capturing this flag. So that was 1871. In the 1970s, some Korean officials went to the United States Naval Academy to take measurements of the flag to make reproductions. And then both in 1999 and also 2003, I visited the flag, and this is what it looked like in the United States Naval Academy Museum, all rolled up with just a little explanation down here as to what it was. Most people didn't know. But then in 2007, it did return. I was, as you can see, I was very, very happy to actually touch the flag. That was quite an honor for me. And then that was when I first met Mr. Jae-sun, who's the great-great-grandson of General Jae-yun, along with his younger sister and his niece. And over the years, Mr. and I have become very, very close friends. And just showing some of the historical surveys. So this is finding like the brass casing. That was back in 2010. This is a whole cartridge here, and here's a case. And I made some reproductions. Shell fragment. And also I made an outline of what the 12-pounder shell would have been full size. This is a 50 caliber bullet that would have been fired by a US sailor where I found it. And it's very important where you find things. Where you find the shell casings, well, you can tell who fired from that position in the case of brass casings. And spent bullets, you can tell where the enemy was, where they were shooting at. This was a 58 caliber bullet for the Springfield rifle that the Marines would have used. So this would have been fired by a Marine. Back in 2011, that was my son 10 years ago. And here, this is actually a lead shot that my son found, and it went to the canister. That's kind of unusual. Most of the shot was iron, but there were some that were lead. Here's my son also found this shell fragment showing a fuse placement. And then this is what it would have looked like on a shell itself. Now, this is an exploded fuse, but this one is not from the Sinmiyangyo. This one is from the American Civil War. And also a Korean musket ball. Fourth survey in May of 2011. This is a reproduced 36 caliber, which would have been, as I said, for the cap and ball version of the officer sidearm. And this was a 38 caliber original spent bullet. And then Korean reproduced 45 caliber musket ball for the matchlock. And this is an original that I recovered. Here's a live Schenkel shell that a former colleague of mine found. It was a dud, very evidently, but still live. So it was still dangerous. And he gave this to the Korean Army Museum, and they disarmed it, and it's now among their collection. And then this another survey that was done back in 2012 with a lot of the relics here, that were found, including I even found an iron arrowhead, even though bows and arrows were not used in the Sinmiyangyo. This was a percussion cap that was found in the area where the Marines had been. This is what was used on the Springfield and the Whitneyville Plymouth. A water cap fuse tab, and you can't read it here, so I put a little diagram here showing 5 seconds. So this was a 5-second fuse, and it would have been for this would have been off of a rifled shell. So this was shot by a rifled by the one rifled boat howitzer that the Americans had, and this was found on Artillery Hill 1. And then this again is that ground exploded Schenkel. This is a 4-inch Schenkel. This is as it appeared in the ground. It buried itself in the ground and it exploded in the ground on Hwangsando, what the Americans call Louise Island. And then my colleague found this, and then he pieced it back together, and it had probably 90+% of it was still intact. So and this easily could have been the very first shot fired in the 3-day battle. One other item that's of interest was this was a sword that was captured in the 1871 fighting, and it was the property of Captain McLean Tilton, who was the captain of Marines. As a matter of fact, he's the one who you see in the he's the Marine officer that you see in the photo in front of the Sujagi flag. But anyway, this sword was captured, and then his son, McLean Tilton Jr., in the early 20th century, I'm guessing probably maybe as late as the 1920s, but probably earlier than that, he gave this sword to a lady, Mrs. Thomas B. Lyons, who was a friend of his family, and she was also the head of the local Daughters of the American Revolution in his city in Virginia, where he lived. And so evidently the sword for quite a few years was on the wall of the Daughters of the American Revolution hall in that area, until it went into an estate auction. And last year I found out about it, and Mr. He wanted it for our association that we have that is for his grandfather in the Sinmiyangyo. And so I arranged to get this back to Korea, and so now it's in Mr. U's possession. Just a week and a half ago, we had a seminar up in Seoul, and this was sponsored by Mr. U's great-great-grandfather's association. And I gave a very similar lecture, but all of the slides there were all in Korean. I tried to make that easier on my audience. And this photo here, right beside me, this is also Mr. Jae-sung. And then we also had a panel discussion. And the very last thing here is, for anyone who is interested, is my book on the Sinmiyangyo, both print and ebook version. The ebook came out last year in June. And then the print version I published through Amazon.com at the beginning of February. So it's rather recent. Well, that is mainly it.
Mainly it. Huh? Fascinating. Thank you. Folks, we're open for questions. If you want to use the raise hand function in Zoom, that would be fine, or type a question in the chat box and I'll try to make sure we get around to everybody before we run out of time. We've got about 30 minutes we can use if you have things to talk about. Questions to be answered. Mr. Kim, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sunny Kim, and thanks for the lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And I do appreciate that you bring the flag from the U.S. Naval Academy back to Korea. I really appreciate it as a patriotic Korean. Yeah, I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
The Korean West Coast, we call it Hwanghae.
Mm-hmm.
West coast of Korean Peninsula is notorious for the tidal differences. So it's one of the biggest in the world.
Mm-hmm.
When the American sailors were doing the expedition alongside the coastal area, were they knowledgeable enough to do the expedition? You know, there were 5 ships.
Mm-hmm.
They have to, you know, I mean, it's quite the mass.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably imagine that, you know, moving along the west coast of the Korean Peninsula would be very, could have been a formidable work for them.
Yeah.
So they must have had some sort of very in-depth knowledge about the coastal information and the tidal informations.
Yes.
That is the one question for you.
Okay. Well, let me handle that one first. They received from the French the charts that the French used in 1866.
Okay.
And then they modified the charts. Well, of course, putting things into English and such for themselves. Even though when you look at their charts, they still had French scattered here and there on the charts. But
is that right? Okay.
But yeah, so the French actually did the first. Well, at least I should say that the French charts were the first ones that the Americans used when they came in there. The Americans had hoped to make more detailed, take more detailed soundings and such, and that was their purpose on going up the Yamha on June 1st, was to do that. So, but anyway, yes, they got a lot of their information from the French from 5 years prior.
Oh, is that right? So French was the one who did the this, what is it, tidal survey or coastal survey?
The initial one that I know of. I mean, they may have received, you know, possibly from other sources or something, ones that preceded them, but they're the first one that I know of.
Okay. Can I have a second question to
Sure.
you, if I may?
Sure.
And yeah, at the beginning of your lecture, there were Korean delegates, I would say. 3 Korean delegates, you know, came to this American sailors. And then they exchanged the conversation. And then the Korean delegates were not really clear about, you know, their intention.
Right.
So my question to you is, I mean, I'm sure, you know, there must have been some sort of cultural differences in terms of the communicating, you know, one's intention. But so my question to you is that have the Korean delegates or government officers been very clear about their intention, not wanting American soldiers to land on the Korean land, or just move into the what is it, Han River, the result would have been different, any different?
You know, and I've actually thought about that one myself over the years. I think personally, I think it may have been a little different, the outcome. If they had been very clear, I think the Americans probably would have pressed them further, you know, and probably even trying to get, you know, written permission if possible, or whatever it would take. But that is a question that I have often wondered myself. You know, it's one of these what if type things. You know, we can never really know the answer to it. We can just kind of make a guess. I think the Americans may not have gone up quite as briskly as they did if they had been very clearly warned against doing so. But that's just my personal opinion on that.
Okay, my third question, I'll make it really quick.
Okay, we got some other people waiting. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, is that right? Okay, then if the people is waiting, I just reserve myself.
Well,
I'll just pass the opportunity to others.
Okay, Mr. Kim, if we get done and there's time, let me come back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Question doesn't get answered. Okay, Mr. Song.
Oh, got your mute on there.
Unmute your mic, please.
I have to say that to my students frequently.
There we go. We can hear you, Mr. Song. Go ahead.
Oh, it was a very fascinating lecture and very detailed. I didn't realize that you put in so much effort into researching this issue. I guess in Korea did not have any kind of relationship with the US in 1871. So when this incident occurred and when the ship went out of Korea, did Korea take any kind of make a protest later on once the relationship got Korea established diplomatic relationship with the U.S.? Or was this matter dropped as if nothing happened? After all, over 300 Koreans were killed.
Yeah, I don't think there was really too much protest later on that went on, at least not officially. Korea did stay in contact with the government in China, what is now China anyway. And you know, a lot of what the Americans had complained about, you know, the Koreans were memorializing themselves and even answering the questions that they were getting from China about what was going on. And the Koreans were just basically saying that, you know, we would never allow warships, foreign warships, you know, to go up our waterways. And, you know, to the Koreans, it was like, well, our boundaries were breached and we defended ourselves. And I have often said that, you know, and this is a little bit off track from what you were saying, but I've often said that, you know, what would the United States have done if some foreign warship started going up the Mississippi River? I mean, would they say, oh yeah, sure, come right on in? No, I tend to doubt it. I think there would have been a response. And Korea just took the same, or at least a very similar response to that. But as far as complaints go, when the United States finally made a treaty with Korea in 1882, it was, of course, a very unequal treaty. But I'm not really aware of any major official complaints or anything that were made. There may have been, but I'm just not really aware of them.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
There's a question in the chat box from Mr. Jeffrey Owen. First, some comment. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Would ask if you could mention what reactions or events followed the battle within months or a year or two from 1871. Was there any international news about that?
Yes, actually, you know, when the, and this is actually kind of an interesting thing in a way. When the Americans left, now, as I said, they left Korean waters in July 3rd. So they stayed in Korean waters for a few weeks. Instead of, you know, they left Ganghwa Island June 12th to go back to their ships, but they stayed in Korean waters for about 3 weeks. And the reason why they did that was because they felt if they left too soon, it would look like Korea kicked them out. And that was a very, very problematic thing at the time, because in China was having its own foreigner problem, where where Chinese were being very anti-foreigner. And so it was worried that if the United States left too soon, that might embolden anti-foreigner action in China and would make problems there. So the United States stayed in Korean waters just to show that, oh, we'll leave when we're ready to leave. And then when the United States did finally leave, this is one of the times where the General Sherman kind of comes into it, because the United States really had very little to show for their attack on Korea. They took a lot of war trophies. You know, besides the flag, they took cannons and guns and all kinds of things as war trophies, but they really had nothing substantial to show for what happened. And this is where some of the sailors and even officers afterwards started talking about, well, we were doing this because of the General Sherman. So this is something they did after the fact. You know, that's one of the reasons why I think the General Sherman kind of also shows up a little bit, but it was not a direct reason. That was never an official reason for the United States going there. And then if you look at the, then if you look at what the newspapers and other periodicals and such were showing afterwards, most of them were recounting just what happened, what the battles were like. I went through so many newspapers and such from the time, and there are just really some very, very greatly narrated battle scenes. Some of them not true. I mean, some people had very, very vivid imaginations with what they were writing. But there were also others that were fairly accurate. And of course, the United States was trying to put on their best face for this, you know, that they accomplished something, even if it was a post facto reason, you know, when they dragged the General Sherman into it. I hope that answered the question. If not, feel free to shoot me an email or something. I'll try to further answer your question.
Anybody else with questions? If not, I'm going to go back to Mr. Kim.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, go ahead first, and then Mr. Kim after.
David from Maryland. Thank you very much for the lecture. It's fascinating. I've heard your lectures many times before, and more informative. So thank you. I do have a question about the China and Japan's role prior to their expedition, as well as afterwards, if they had any influence. And the other question I have is how much of resources, your background information is from Korean and the US. It sounds like most of it is from the US side. So I'm kind of interested what kind of information that you receive from the Korea side, and how does it reflect in terms of, I know you talked about it a little bit from your assessment. And last question, I apologize, is that what's the impact today in U.S.-Korea relationship? Thank you.
Well, let's kind of look at these one by one, and I'll probably have to ask you to refresh my memory. The first one was about Japan and China had any influence on the 1871 action. Is that right?
Yes, if they had any provided information, or they had either influenced us or actually Joseon Taewoong-gun through the diplomatic efforts.
Well, China especially, because of course the Chinese government, for a time they were kind of like the go-between between the United States and the Joseon government. But the thing was, they didn't want that position. And after a while, you could see you could kind of see the exasperation that people were having in the Chinese, I should say, the Chinese government officials were having, when the United States would be saying, okay, we want you to tell the Joseon government this. And then, you know, the Joseon government would say, well, tell the Americans this. And they were, I think it was a little bit of a headache for them. Japan really, as far as I know, there really was nothing substantial at all that Japan had to do with it, as far as I know. China, mainly China in that case. What was your second question?
From the from your reading of research on the Koreans recording or Joseon records, how does it reflect in terms of you know, the outcome of it?
Now, mostly, now you see, and this is one thing, there really is there's a kind of a dearth of information in Korea about this. The Joseon Wangjo Shillok doesn't, it just basically tells only the bare bones about things that happen, and sometimes it exaggerated the Korean side a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit, some things. But I think they were working with what news they were getting from their sources, and their sources were exaggerating to them what was going on. So there really was not a lot of information from the Korean side. And so when I was doing my research, I really truly was trying to find as many Korean sources as possible. Probably Professor Kim Won-mo was the best source. He wrote a very lengthy book on the relations between the United States and Korea. And I really truly recommend his book to anyone who really wants to see something that goes really into depth on it. So his was probably one of my main sources, besides the Shillok. I did read through the Shillok as much as possible to glean as much as I could. And the problem is that many of the other Korean sources that I found, really all they did was they translated American sources, and they also translated a lot of inaccurate things. So that became a problem. That it was like, okay, I know this isn't accurate, and so I could see where they were getting a lot of their information from, and it was, so the Korean sources were really kind of a hard one to pin down. So that's why not only using the American records, which actually were quite, the American officers kept very detailed records. And then when I was able to verify things through field research, that was when I started feeling more comfortable. It was until I was able to actually do the field research, you know, it was like, okay, how much of this is being exaggerated by the American side? But I found the American records to be fairly accurate. Yeah, it still kind of tells one side of things. And right now I'm kind of waiting on Ajay's son, the great-great-grandson. He is working on his own book that is looking from the Korean side. And he's going through a lot of records that he's trying to find actually a lot of records too, and looking for very specific things. And also the seminar we just had a week and a half ago, there was a lot of good information that came out of that too. You know, I'm learning things about this myself all the time. I'm so happy when I learn something, I smile. It's like, great, you know, new information. I love it. And you had a third question, did I miss?
What does it mean today in U.S.-Korea
Oh.
relations? Sorry for asking so many, but thank you.
You know, I was basically asked that by a reporter before I went up to the Seoul conference. And I think that right now, maybe not a lot. And the reason I say that is because still people don't know very much about it. And it's one reason why now, this being the 150th anniversary, you know, I'm hoping to get more people to learn more about it. But the people I think who know about it and such, you know, you see where we started, you know, especially with 1871. And there was a lot of, you know, it was not a good situation between the United States and Korea. And then you look at where we are today, and, you know, we still have problems. I mean, you know, even brothers and sisters fight with each other over things. So, you know, Korea and the United States, you know, fight over different things, you know, trade and military presence, etc. But I think that just overall, the situation here, you know, between the United States and Korea today is one of, I think, friendship, at least, you know, aspirational, if nothing else.
Okay, Mr. Kim, what was your third question, please?
Yes, my third question was that Sinmiyangyo has been dealt with a great deal. When I was, you know, studying about the Korean history at high school. So whenever, you know, Korean people talk about the towards the end of the turn of the century historical event, Sinmiyangyo is the one of the, you know, first ones to be talked about. And it has been, that event has been dramatized over and over, especially in Mr. Sunshine. Yeah, right. So I mean, Sinmiyangyo is a big thing to Korean people and to Korean history. But on the contrary, what kind of significance does Sinmiyangyo have from the Americans' point of view, or in American history? That was my third question.
Okay, well, and again, you know, most Americans know very little or nothing about it. It really is hardly even a blip on the American history screen at all. However, again, when Americans I know learn about it, they're very fascinated. It's like, wow, you know, because it really was an important moment in Korean American relations. It's one that's very unknown to most people, but it is an important one, because it was not necessarily the best first impression. I think we can all agree on that, but it was an important point.
Okay. Thank you.
There's a final question here in the chat box. During that first meeting between the U.S. Navy officers and the three representatives, what language was used for their communication? Korean, Chinese, English?
Yeah, it was mostly Chinese. The Edward Drew, he he was able to speak, read, and write Chinese fluently. And he also had his two scribes with him. Now, I have heard some stories that at least one of the scribes was actually, shown as Chinese, but was actually Korean Russian. I had read that someplace, and it's possible, I suppose. But another thing that some Koreans found kind of interesting is that there actually were Koreans who were in the American muster rolls on their ships. One was actually a very young boy. And he was picked up by the Americans in China, and he was used as a cabin boy on the USS Colorado. And I suppose, it's very possible that he might have had something added into this. Now, there were actually also 5 fishermen, Korean fishermen, who were originally aboard the Colorado. They were shipwrecked, and the Americans were wanting to use them also kind of as a bargaining tool. Hey, here, we good faith here. We brought some of your countrymen back to you. Please be nice to us. The thing was that when I understand that when these 5 fishermen learned about that, they really truly didn't want to be with the Americans when they went into Korean waters. They said, please leave us in Japan and we'll find our own way home, because they were quite certain that, and probably rightfully so, if they were seen with the Americans, they'd probably be executed. Because, and they knew this. It's like, no, just leave us in Japan. We'll find our own way home. Thank you very much.
Well, very good. Our time has approached. Thank you all for joining our lecture tonight. And Tom, thank you very much for a fascinating review of that story. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A few announcements. The next online meeting of the Literature Club is Thursday, June 17th, and they will be reading Bae Myung-hoon's futuristic novel, Tower. Print copies are available from several sources, ebooks from Amazon and others perhaps. The colloquium will be held Thursday, June 10th. Both of these are online gatherings still. On June 10th at the colloquium, Brother Anthony, President Emeritus of RAS Korea, will be lecturing on the topic, Korean Poetry and Fiction in English Translation. The Business and Culture Club meets June 15th at noon at Gwanghwamun Station of Line 5, exit number 7. They're going to wander through the current renovations taking place at Gwanghwamun Plaza. Many of you may already know this, but we are saddened to announce the death of our dear past president and council member, Peter Bartholomew. Peter unexpectedly died last week. A memorial wake will be held this coming Saturday, May 29th, from 9 a.m. until the following morning, Sunday, May 30th, at about 8:30 a.m., when Peter will take his final journey. The location is the Funeral Hall of Korea University Hospital in Anamdong in Seoul. Our next lecture on June 8th will be by Agata Duro, a visiting researcher at Hiroshima City University in Japan. She is from Hungary and obtained her PhD in Peace Studies from the Graduate School of International Studies, Hiroshima City University, in 2017. She's authored several articles, and her current research focuses on Japanese and South Korean grassroots movements to repatriate the remains of Koreans buried in wartime Japanese graves. So please check our website and our YouTube channel where you can find recordings of past lectures and hopefully other useful content. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks on June 8th. Thank you and have a good night.